Hello friends, Jan Curcio back with Breaking Bread for you. Now it goes without saying that most people in the world have heard about Melech Shlomo, King Solomon of ancient Israel, as they would have of Ramses of Egypt, Alexander the Great of Macedonia, and Napoleon Bonaparte of France. Yet Solomon stands apart from them all as an icon of divinely instilled wisdom and justice in leadership. Yet those who examine his life as we are going to do will find that this King of Kings was all too human, and that his God-given wisdom was not always exercised, the consequences of which had been far-reaching to the eventual loss of Israel's nationhood, taking 2,400 years to recoup. Now, Solomon was born around 1010 BC to King David and Bathsheba, David's 10th son and Bathsheba's second, whose first son with David died shortly after birth. Now, Solomon succeeded David to the throne, becoming the third king of united Israel, having reigned for 40 years during what is called the Golden Age of Israel, with borders extended as far as they ever had been, and with a level of peace and prosperity that has not been achieved ever since. So it was a time in ancient Israel that from Dan to Beersheba, that as the saying goes, when each Ben Israel lived in safety, everyone under his own vine and their own fig tree. 1 Kings 4:25. Solomon attained that peace with the surrounding nations through diplomatic means and by enlarging the military left from David's regime. In addition, he eliminated any internal threats to his kingship, even executing his half-brother Adonijah, who expected that he should be king instead of Solomon. He also had Joab executed, the general he inherited from his father, who not only betrayed King David by killing his servant Abner, but supported Adonijah's claim to Solomon's throne. 1 Kings 2:29-34. And unable to kill a high priest, Solomon demoted Abiathar, sending him home permanently, since he also supported Adonijah's claim to the throne. And so Zadok took his place as high priest. 1 Kings 4:14. Now, about Israel's prosperity at that time, Solomon accumulated the equivalency of $40 billion each year in gold through trade deals, tribute from foreign nations, and tax revenue imposed on Israel. Yet Solomon's greatest accomplishment was in maintaining the borders Jehovah promised to Abraham, illustrated in this map in the light yellow, compared with modern Israel in green. And it says in Genesis 15, beginning in verse 18, "On that day Adonai cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your seed, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, the Kenite, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Raphites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgasites, and the Jebusites." Genesis 15:18-21. To secure those borders as he had, Solomon built up a vast military with an impressive cavalry of 12,000 charioteers and 40,000 horses he based in outposts throughout the land. And inside those borders, Solomon rebuilt the cities of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and several ports, the most notable Ezion Gezer, modern Eilat, the main port of commerce from where his ships manned by Phoenician sailors exported goods to India, Arabia, and Africa, and returning with such goods as gold, silver, rare woods, and ivory. Also, Solomon was able to seize control of land trade routes through alliances with nations from where caravans originated, solidified through marriage to royal daughters. And this is how Solomon, considered to be this king of all kings in that part of the world, built up a harem of all harems in that part of the world, with 700 wives and 300 concubines. And the most notable of his foreign wives was his first, the Princess of Egypt, who was unnamed, and later the Princess of Ammon, modern Jordan, whose name is Naamah, who bore Solomon a son named Rehoboam, becoming Israel's fourth king. We don't know anything about her status, but most likely, had the Queen Mother Bathsheba been alive, Naamah would have been under her control, along with all the other hundreds of wives and concubines. Given Solomon's successor having been Rehoboam, it is likely that his mother Naamah had replaced Bathsheba as queen, who would have influenced the king to choose her son over all the others as the next king of Israel. And in regard to Solomon's women, his legendary dalliance with the Queen of Sheba must be mentioned here, who traveled from afar to witness for herself the majesty and wisdom of this world-renowned king. She came to Jerusalem with a tribute of 120 talents of gold and many other precious goods, worth around 120 million USD. And we are told that she got her money's worth, having Solomon answer all of her questions. And I quote from 2 Chronicles chapter 9, 5 through 6. She said to the king, "The report that I heard in my own land about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe their reports until I came and saw with my own eyes. And behold, not even half of the greatness of your wisdom was described to me. You surpassed the report that I heard." Now, according to the Rastafarians, who originate from Ethiopia, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, whose name they say was Makeda, produced a son, which would have benefited the king in gaining control of the caravan trade out of that part of the world. Yet there is no biblical evidence that Solomon produced a son through the Queen of Sheba. Now, many have made fun of Solomon due to his insane accumulation of wives and concubines, 1 Kings 9, 1 through 25, of which Zadok the high priest apparently failed to point out to him from the Torah the danger of that. And I quote from Deuteronomy 17:17, where it says, "Nor should he, the king, multiply wives for himself, so that his heart does not turn aside." And the author of the book of Kings proved that caveat true. And I quote him from 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 6, where it says, "Now King Solomon loved so many foreign women, besides the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom Adonai had said to the children of Israel, 'You shall not associate with them, nor they associate with you, for surely they would turn your heart away after their gods.'" That comes from Exodus 34, verse 15. And it goes on to say, Solomon clung to them for love. So he had 700 wives as princesses, not queens, and 300 concubines, and his women led his heart astray. For it came about as Solomon grew old that his wives led his heart away after other gods, so that his heart was no longer wholly devoted to Adonai his God, unlike the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, that is, child sacrifice. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Adonai and did not fully follow after Adonai, unlike his father David. But it must be recognized that young Solomon began his reign having a heart for God, as David had, committed to ruling his people with righteousness and justice, having a humble spirit, and sincerely petitioning Jehovah for wisdom to lead the nation. 1 Kings 3, 6 through 9. And as we know, Jehovah gave him a great deal of wisdom, most memorably demonstrated in the dispute between two prostitutes who each claimed to be the mother of an infant. 1 Kings 3, 16 through 28. If you will recall, one of them had rolled over on her child who died as the result, and then took her roommate's infant, pretending it was hers, which is why they ended up standing before the judgment seat of Solomon. And in his wisdom, Solomon decreed that the infant be cut in two, so that each prostitute would get one half, all the time knowing that the true mother would emerge to forfeit her half so that the child would live. So it happened that the true mother claimed that the infant belonged to the other, while the false one argued that the infant should be cut in half anyway. And it is said that due to this demonstration of the divinely instilled wisdom of the king, that all Israel feared God. Verse 28. Now Solomon also used that wisdom to design a house for Jehovah, taking 7 years to complete, producing a gem for all nations to admire. 1 Kings chapters 6 through 8. And as wise leaders do, he delegated the design and construction of the temple to one with that expertise, Phoenician King Hiram of Tyre, modern Lebanon, who also supplied the cedar, pine, and gold for its interior. Solomon taxed the people to fund the construction of the temple, as well as many other building projects in which he used forced labor, as had King David. 70,000 of them, from the descendants of Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites left in the land Joshua had not conquered, and Hittites who migrated to Israel from Anatolia in the north. 1 Kings 9:20 through 21. And when the temple was completed, Solomon had the Ark of the Covenant relocated from the city of David, where it had rested in the tabernacle of Moses, and placed it in the Holy of Holies between two 15-foot golden cherub statues, where it had remained for about 400 years until the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Solomon had the temple and its furnishings richly adorned with layering of gold, including the menorah and incense altar he set in front of the purple, scarlet, and blue curtain that separated the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies. 2 Chronicles 2. Now, the dedication of the temple did not take place for 11 months after its completion, until the following October, perhaps when Solomon and/or Zadok the high priest thought it best to have it during the fall feasts, most likely the Feast of Tabernacles, given that the dedication was likewise celebrated for 7 days. 2 Chronicles 7, 8, and 9. The king assembled the elders and tribal heads and a magnificent choir with musicians who played on silver trumpets, lyres, drums, and other instruments of the ancient world. This dedication had to have been the most glorious day of Solomon's 40-year reign. It marked the time for the worship of Jehovah to be centralized in Jerusalem, for up to that point Israel worshipped at local shrines, such as in Gibeon, Bethel, and Shiloh. Unfortunately, due to the prohibition of the Jerusalem Waqf, the Islamic Trust of Muslim edifices, no archaeological excavation has been allowed on or around the Temple Mount that could uncover material evidence that Solomon's temple was constructed there and just where it had been set. The chronicler wrote that at the dedication of the temple, as Solomon raised his hands to pray, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and sacrifice, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple so that the priests could not enter, but instead bowed down to the ground, praising Adonai. 2 Chronicles 8, 1 through 3. And about Solomon's prayer of dedication, it was more than supplication. It was prophetic concerning Israel's eventual apostasy and exile that he himself had caused. Solomon prayed, beginning in verse 46 of 1 Kings chapter 8, and I quote, "If they sin against you, for there is no man that does not sin, and you become angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, and their captors carry them away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near, Yet if they take it to the heart in the land which they have been carried captive, and they repent and make supplication to you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned, we have committed iniquity, we have acted wickedly, and they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who carried them into exile, and pray to you toward their land that you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house which I have built for your name, then hear their prayer and their supplication in heaven, your dwelling place. Maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, as well as all their transgressions they have transgressed against you, and grant them mercy before their captors, so that they may have mercy on them. For they are your people and your inheritance that you brought out of Egypt, out of the middle of the iron furnace. 1 Kings 8:46 through 51. Little did Solomon fathom the consequence of the deadly trend of idol worship that he set in motion for his successors to the throne, with practicing the abominable religious rites of his foreign wives, even child sacrifice in the Topheths ovens just below the Temple Mount in the Hinnom Valley. During the 7th century, King Manasseh of Judah followed in Solomon's footsteps, who is said to have sacrificed so many of his offspring to Molech, 2 Kings 21, that it provoked Jehovah's wrath to fall on Jerusalem through the Babylonian assault, when Jerusalem and the temple were utterly destroyed, 2 Kings 25. That judgment came in spite of his grandson's Josiah's comprehensive social religious reforms, a judgment long-lasting, with the Jews regaining autonomy in the land in 1948 after 2,400 years. Despite Solomon's accomplishments, the king made himself rather unpopular, especially with those in the north, by taxing them for revenue to complete the temple, his palace, the house for his Egyptian wife, the house of the forest of Lebanon, which is the Hall of Justice, and many others in and around Jerusalem. Towards the end of his reign, Solomon dealt with insurrections and attacks from both foreign and domestic enemies by kings Hadad of Edom and Rezin of Damascus. And internally, Solomon was threatened by his servant Jeroboam, whom the prophet Ahijah had prophesied would rule over the 10 tribes of Israel, 1 Kings 11:28. And so Jeroboam fled for his life to Egypt. And sadly, as was prophesied, Solomon's territory was to be decreased to just Judah that had been combined with Benjamin, and that was due to the promise Jehovah had made to his father David, 1 Kings 11:29 through 31. Otherwise, it would have all been lost. Solomon died around 60 years of age from natural cause, and remarkably, as great a king as he had been, and although it is said that he was buried in the city of David, there is no tomb that claims his remains. 1 Kings 11:43. Rehoboam succeeded his father to the throne, but unfortunately did not inherit his wisdom and leadership skills, and whose foolishness caused a civil war to break out between the northern and southern regions of United Israel. This resulted in the nation splitting, as shown in this map, with the north thereafter referred to as Israel, which was first ruled by Jeroboam, while Rehoboam continued to rule over Judah in the south. And this is where the decrease of Solomon's territory was actualized. The division of Israel was the beginning of the end, for as with any nation divided, they fall prey to competing nations, as happened with the invasions of Assyria in 722 BC and Babylon in 586 BC. Hearing about Solomon's death, Jeroboam returned to do just what had been prophesied over him, to rule over the 10 northern tribes. King Jeroboam, like Solomon, was an idolater who led the 10 tribes to worship the golden bull idol that represented Baal, the Canaanite fertility god, and temples he established in Dan in the north and Bethel in the south. And he did that to keep the people from worshiping at Solomon's temple, where King Rehoboam could gain control over them. 1 Kings 12. So that was a synopsis of King Solomon's life. But what about his legacy? Well, we can say it has endured for the past 3 millennia in the hearts of countless souls who have loved the God of the Bible and seek his wisdom through the writings ascribed to this great king. It is said that Solomon produced 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs, 1 Kings 4:32, copies of which we do not have. What we do have is the Mishle, the book of Proverbs, and the Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, and Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, also referred to as the Song of Solomon. These 3 works are part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, found in the Ketuvim, the writings section, beginning with my favorite, the book of Ecclesiastes, the very first book of the Bible I randomly opened up to, with my eyes falling on that most often quoted verse. Yet when I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended to accomplish it, behold, it all was futile and chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2:11. The self-description of the writer clearly points to Solomon's authorship. In this book, the king, who refers to himself as the Kohelet, meaning teacher or preacher, bemoans that in spite of all that he had accomplished, even more than any other king, for him it was all vanity, futility, or as he coined the expression, chasing after the wind. And the points he makes are quite valid, such as all that he had worked for would eventually go to one who had not worked for any of it, writing, "Who knows if he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master over all the fruit of my toil for which I had wisely labored under the sun. This too is futile." Chapter 2, verse 19. Reading between the lines, I take it that he might have known that his incompetent son Rehoboam would inherit his throne. Had Solomon lived to see the devastation Rehoboam had caused to the nation, he would have realized how profoundly futile all his efforts had been in making Israel the greatest nation in the Middle East at that time. But most importantly, Solomon finishes this work stating the only thing worth doing in this life, and I quote him, "A final word when all has been heard. Fear God and keep his mitzvot, his commandments, for this applies to all mankind. God will bring every deed into judgment, including everything that is hidden, whether it is good or evil." Chapter 12, 13, and 14. And Solomon's Mishle, the book of Proverbs, is ascribed to him with the exception of chapter 25, verse 1, written by a seer or seers in Hezekiah's court, chapter 30 by an Arab wisdom writer by the name of Agur, and chapter 31 written by King Lemuel, all of whom we know nothing about. Evidently, they had attracted the attention of either Solomon and or an editor who later attached them to Solomon's collection of proverbs. Now, a proverb is an ancient, short, wise saying that is for the most part true, yet not guaranteed to always deliver what it promises. As parents, we want to believe Psalm 22:6, where it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not turn from it." And of course, we have seen where this has not always been the case, as much as it is hoped for. And proverbs are generally poetic, Hebraic poetry, not as we know poetry that rhymes with sound, but as the ancient Near Easterners with the repetition of ideas meant to emphasize the point. Now, it appears that most of Proverbs is addressed to the writer's son, sons, or disciples, given that disciples of the prophets and rabbis were referred to in the ancient world as sons. And much of the Mishle warns of the dangers of being involved with immoral women, with King Lemuel describing the virtuous wife in chapters 30 through 10 through 31, a great finish to Solomon's anthology of Proverbs. There are also warnings about disobeying parents, making promises that cannot be kept, the danger of wicked men, the path of foolishness, the abomination of dishonesty, and many other things sons need to be made aware of. Yet relevant to all genders of all ages is the instruction to embrace wisdom. And I quote, "Lay hold of my words in your heart, keep my commands, and you will live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her," that is wisdom, "and she will guard you. Love her, and she will watch over you." Chapter 4, 4 through 6. And about Proverbs in general, the ancient rabbis taught that just one proverb at a time should be read and meditated on throughout the day, getting it under our skin, as opposed to reading a chapter at a time, as most of us do. Now, the third work of Solomon we want to take a look at is the Song of Songs, a romantic drama taken in traditional Judaism to be an allegory of Jehovah's love for his people Israel, as well as his Messiah's love for his bride, agreed to in Messianic Judaism and the Christian Church. Herein, Solomon used the imagery of courtship, wedding, and marriage with sexual intimacy. And its most well-quoted line, often recited during Jewish nuptials, is Ani ledodi vedodi li. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. 2:16. And it is due to its sensual nature that it was rejected by many rabbis who met at Yamnia in the late 1st century to finalize the canon of the Tanakh. However, understanding its metaphorical value, the great Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef vehemently argued that it could not be left out of the canon, reasoning that if all the other books of the Bible were Kedoshim, then the Song of Songs must be considered Kedosh Kedoshim, Holy of Holies, Mishnah Yadayim 3:5, and thereby Song of Songs was accepted into the canon of the Tanakh. And it has been taken that Solomon wrote this work about his first love, his first wife, referred to in the book as Shulamit, chapter 6. Many have taken it that she was his first wife, the princess of Egypt, who is unnamed. However, the text indicates that at the time Solomon married Shulamit, he had 60 wives and 80 concubines. 6:8. The name Shulamit means peaceful, as does the name Solomon, Shlomo, and so it is thought that it is actually her married name taken from Solomon, particularly since she is first referred to as Shulamit after they are married in chapter 6. Now let me say that Song of Songs is not an easy story to understand at first reading, given that it appears that Shulamit has 2 lovers who can be easily confused with one another, one being a shepherd and the other King Solomon. Some argue that they are actually one and the same lover, while others say that the shepherd is her true love, but that she must leave him, being called to marry the king. But going with the single lover model, one of the fitting story plots is that Shulamit falls in love with a humble shepherd from her hometown of Shunem. Unbeknownst to her is King Solomon, who happens to be incognito posing as a shepherd while taking a break from his royal duties in nearby Megiddo where he stabled his war horses. And later he returns to Shunan, revealing his true identity to Shulamit and his purpose of coming to fetch her as his royal bride. It is said that the Song of Songs is either a lyrical poem written to extol the virtues of marital love, or it is a true story of one of Solomon's marriages. Yet there is more to be recognized in the story from its allegorical interpretation. And that allegory is a most fitting picture of Yeshua Messiah, who came for his bride as a humble shepherd, but is coming back for her as the King of all kings, to take her to the marriage supper of the Lamb. In a dream, Shulamit hears her lover knocking at her door, but fails to answer it in time. This recalls Yeshua's letter to the apathetic and materialistic Laodicean church of Asia Minor, in which he declares, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me." Revelation 3:20. And about Yeshua as that King of all kings, one of the least likely of the King of all kings of the ancient Near East, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, declared after he had regained his sanity that Jehovah had taken away due to his arrogance, saying, "And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are true and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride he is able to put down." Daniel 4:35 and 36. And the prophet Isaiah said that Adonai reduces the princes and rulers of the earth to nothing. Isaiah 40:21 through 23. King David recognized Adonai as ruler over all in Psalm 103:19. And he proclaimed in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 11, "Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all." And in the New Testament, the resurrected Christ declares of himself to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Matthew 28:18. And Paul wrote to Timothy stating, "God, the blessed and only ruler, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone is immortal and who lives in unapproachable light, to him be honor and might forever." 2 Timothy 6:15 and 16. John wrote in the introduction to the letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, "And from Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth." Revelation 1:5. Later in Revelation, John wrote, "They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings." 17:14. And he wrote, "On his robe and on his thigh he has this name written, King of kings and Lord of lords." Revelation 19:16. This all stands to remind us that as the King of kings, Yeshua has absolute dominion over everything that exists, and that we are to live in submission to his teachings, commandments, instructions, whatever you choose to call them. Like Jesus or Yeshua, who perfectly obeyed his Father in every way, even unto the cross, so must we. And in doing that, we show ourselves worthy to be his sons and daughters. And as Yeshua said, it is the way we demonstrate our love for him. But on a more personal level, Jesus warned his disciples shortly before he was executed that they would have trouble in their lives, but encouraged them by proclaiming that he had overcome the world, John 16:33. John wrote in his first epistle to those who were facing persecution, "You are from God, children, and you have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world." 1 John 4:4. And so, as God's children, we must believe that he has truly overcome the world, that Jesus is greater than all that comes against us. Our diseases, our financial lack, our family problems, our loneliness, and our failures. If we let those things dominate our minds and our hearts, allowing them to bring us down, we are denying Adonai as the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords, who is greater than any of our sorry situations. Now, I thank you for your patience and for viewing, and I pray that you are blessed in every area of your lives as you immerse yourselves in God's Word and learn of him and what he has for us, and how, although we know he loves us, how we can show our love for him.